I got cut off on that last section, but what I was talking about was one of the reasons why an introduced species might become an invasive species is because it might just by chance happen to be introduced into a habitat or an environment where it has some sort of advantage, especially over the native species. And when that happens, well then the introduced species can easily become an invasive species. So again, multiple factors influence why non-native species turn into damaging pest species. But often the invasive species will exhibit an opportunistic life history pattern, and that's this type 3 survivorship curve, where they reproduce in huge numbers and have early high mortality, but enough of them survive to establish themselves in a particular environment. So picture I found here of what's called the zebra mussel, this smaller little mollusk relative to a clam and stuff, actually growing over a native clam, and their numbers can be vast and could just totally dominate in a freshwater lake environment. So another example is called cheatgrass, which is an invasive plant species in the dry, arid part of the western United States. And it has dominated certain areas and has covered millions of acres of native rangeland that was formerly covered by native grasses and sagebrush. So it's just the biology of this plant that happens to allow it to take over and become an invasive species. The biology being it produces more seeds early in the season than its competitors. So it's able to produce its offspring, right? Seeds and new individuals earlier than the native species, so it gets a jump on the growing season. It matures then also earlier in the summer, and then when it dries, it creates a lot of fuel that will create an abundant amount of fuel, dry grass, that can get easily ignited by lightning. And lightning strikes in the grasslands is actually a common occurrence that will cause grass fires. So as these cheatgrass fires burn, they're more intense than the naturally occurring fires, again, because the cheatgrass is more abundant, it creates more fuel, and then the fires are more frequently, or they occur more frequently than the native plants are used to. So the native plants get decimated and they basically can't rebound. And after a few seasons, a few growing cycles and fire cycles, native plants are essentially gone, and that is a loss of native habitat for over 150 species of birds and mammals in terms of their food and required shelter. So this one species of grass has totally altered some of the ecosystems in large portions of the western United States. And then global climate change has also sped the transition of rangelands into fields of cheatgrass. So yet another problem that has led to an advantage in this particular case of the cheatgrass. Another one, just another example, Burmese pythons. They were set loose, basically they were pets and set loose in southern Florida. And they've now become abundant because based on their biology, the southern Florida environment is a wonderful environment for these snakes. They've become abundant and they've caused problems for native birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibian species. And these can get up to like 20 feet in length. Here's a python consuming a smaller alligator. So biological control of pests is one strategy that's often very useful. So invasive species can benefit from the absence of pathogens, disease-causing organisms, or predators and or herbivores in their new habitats. So one strategy is to introduce a pathogen or a predator or an herbivore that could be detrimental to the invasive species. So this is biological control in the sense of it's the intentional use and release of a natural enemy to attack an introduced pest population, and uses control insects, weeds, and or other organisms that can reduce crop yield. So the biological control, I may have misspoke there. The biological control is used to control pest insects, pest weeds, or other organisms that can reduce crop yield. So for example, here is a wasp. It's called a parasitoid wasp because what it does is, this is a female. She injects her egg into a host animal, in this case a caterpillar, that would eat agricultural plants. The egg hatches, the larvae will consume the caterpillar. So what they find, or what they try to find, is if there's an introduced pest caterpillar or some other insect that damages agricultural crops, they try to find a biological control like a parasitoid wasp that would parasitize the invasive species and control it in that way. So using a biological agent to control an introduced invasive species. Now the danger is, or what the proper approach is to use a biological control agent that is specific for the pest organism. You don't want the biological control to just start damaging or parasitizing any kind of insect, because many insects are actually beneficial. So there's a lot of study and knowledge that needs to go into the appropriate use of biological controls. Here's a famous one, the ladybug beetles or ladybird beetles. As an adult and as a larvae, they decimate. They're really good at eating aphids, and aphids are really harmful for plants in terms of agriculture. So ladybug or ladybird beetles are a great biological control. So biological control has been effective with certain invasive insects and or plant species when used appropriately. So for example, there was a beetle that was brought in to combat St. John's wort, which is an invasive plant that was introduced from Europe and through portions of the western United States. And just like cheatgrass, it's overgrown millions of acres of rangeland and pasture, and actually harmful for grazing animals, livestock. If they eat this, they basically get sick. So how to control such a thing? Well, instead of like using pesticides, which are poisonous, they look for a biological control agent. Oh, and one reason why St. John's wort was introduced is because it's been shown to be effective with depression. How effective, I'm actually not sure. So the imported leaf beetle, relatively small beetle, from the St. John wort's native range in Europe, is a wonderful example of a good biological control agent, because it feeds exclusively on St. John's wort. So where the beetle was introduced, it knocked down the St. John wort's coverage to less than 5% of its former abundance, which means it works wonderfully well. So, so much so that it helped restore the land for grazing and for ranch use. So it was a great success story in terms of biological control. Sometimes biological controls can have devastating effects, the opposite effect. So one hazard is that the imported biological control can become as harmful as its target organism, can be another invasive pest species, or even worse. So one example is the Indian mongoose that was introduced to try to control rats, because it's a pretty vicious predator, in sugarcane plantations by sugarcane farmers. So the mongoose was introduced into many of the Caribbean islands and the Hawaiian islands, and it devastated other organisms besides just rats. It damaged native bird species and became an invasive pest itself. So this is an example of a biological control that was a mistake. So on the islands, the populations of reptiles and amphibians and ground nesting birds have declined or vanished as the mongoose population numbers have grown and spread. So there's a active control programs in these islands to try to control the mongoose that's now an invasive species, where it was inadvertently introduced as a biological control. So let's move on to integrated pest management. So agriculture operates and often creates huge ecosystems where a single crop is grown, so it's called a monoculture. And what happens is you get a loss in biodiversity in terms of different types of plants because they're only growing one type of plant. So it becomes more susceptible to pests. So these plantings are very close together. So for a pest insect or even a virus or a fungus, a modern farm agribusiness is basically like a buffet. So often farms like this get invaded by pest species, whether they be animals like caterpillars or bacteria or viruses or even fungus that can damage the leaves or the roots. One traditional method to deal with these pests is pesticide use. But as we've talked about before, pesticide resistance then becomes a problem in addition to the toxicity of the pesticides in the environment. So integrated pest management strategies come into play. So many of the crop pests have opportunistic life history patterns that allow them to take rapid advantage of favorable habitats. So for example, what's called the cotton weevil or cotton boll weevil, it as a larvae, maggot, and as an adult damages the cotton plant. So it's devastating on two fronts, the boll weevil. So it has spread across parts of the southern United States in the early 1900s and severely damaged local economies that relied to a certain extent on cotton plants and cotton. So pesticides is one traditional use to deal with pests, but however, they often damage non-target organisms, especially bees, which are very important for agriculture. And then pesticide resistance can pop up in the target pests due to natural selection. And again, killing of the pest natural predators is detrimental. And then the killing of pollinators. And then if you have agricultural runoff, the pesticide can wind up in the water environment locally, rivers, streams, lakes. And if enough pesticide gets in there, it can damage the aquatic organisms as well. So broad pesticide use is almost always a bad thing with negative consequences. So integrated pest management, IPM for short, uses a combination of biological, chemical, and cultural methods to have hopefully sustainable agricultural practices that can control agricultural pests. So if you see traps even in the cities or in agriculture, what they're doing is they're monitoring for the appearance of pests, but also trying to get a sense of what the pest population numbers are. And if they're relatively low, then you can get away without using pesticides. So IPM has a couple of strategies. One might seem counterintuitive, but actually tolerate a low level of pests versus an attempt at complete eradication. So with the low level of pests, you have a low loss in terms of plant damage. And then lowering the habitat's carrying capacity for the pest population by using things like pest-resistant varieties of crop through breeding, for example. Mixed species plantings often helps in the sense that a pest often specializes in one plant and not the other. So by having mixed crops, you're providing less habitat and resources for a single particular pest. And then crop rotation helps with that as well.